Welcome everyone to another session of TriTech University. My name is Bill Steppen, and today we're going to start a month-long dive into the long-term contract module. We're going to start off today's session with taking a look at the contract defaults that allow us to build on our contracts from there. We're going to explore what the different defaults are and how you might want to go about setting them up. If this is your first time joining a live stream, over on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see an option to switch to the chat window versus the playlist of the live stream schedule. Feel free to click into that, where you can then use the login link to down at the bottom to input your nickname, or if you prefer, you can sign in with a Facebook account or a Twitter handle, but the nickname is just fine. That way, I can see who you are and you can say hi, and if you've got any questions, feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat box, and I will be monitoring my chat over here so I can see those coming in, and then way we can get those questions answered. Let's go ahead and switch over to my AIM screen here, where we can start to look at the process of building some contract defaults, and then throughout the rest of the month we will go ahead and we will start to explore how to key in contracts, how to take payments, and all of the other fun things that go hand in hand with long-term contracts. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and define what a long-term contract is versus a short-term rental. They are two different modules. So with a long-term contract, the whole idea of a contract is it allows you to take payments over time. In some cases, there might be a specified payoff date, such as the case with rent-to-own or sales contracts. And in other situations, it might just be that the customer is going to make payments until they are done with that rental, what we would call a rent-to-rent or a rent-only type contract. But both of those types of contracts and more are going to be what we're going to be looking at with the long-term contract module. With the short-term rental module, this is more along the lines of a customer pays up front for a specific period of time. Maybe it might be a rental over a weekend or throughout the week, or even just like a one-day rental. But typically a short-term rental has a specified return date. They're not going to rent it for the purposes of purchasing it. They're just going to rent it short-term, and they may extend that rental, but typically the idea is there's one payment either upfront or at the time of the return, and it has a specified return date. So let's go ahead and take a look at the core of any long-term contract, and that is what's called a contract default. Let me go ahead and, no, I think that's big enough. Let me know if that's too small. I can try and zoom in a little bit more. But basically what we're going to have here, over here on the left-hand side of the screen, will be any existing contract defaults that you've already set up. And on the right-hand side of the screen will be how you set them up. I already have an extended warranty type contract here. This is one of the several contract types that you have available in your AIM system. All of these are available with the purchase of the long-term contract module, so it's not like you have to purchase separate little micro options, if you will, of the contract module. But let's take a look, or let's talk about the different contract types. I'm actually going to go ahead and click the Add button here. So I'm adding a new record from scratch. And before we talk about the contract default name, which could be whatever you want it to be named, let's take a look at the contract types. And in fact, I'm going to press F6 on this just to kind of bring up a listing so I can kind of have them over here on the side. And you can see there are 6 types of contract defaults that you can create. You could technically have multiples of the same contract type, but a rent-to-rent is the most basic kind of rental contract. It is where you are renting something indefinitely until you're done with it. If you're in the music industry, this might be best used for your step-up type rentals, where, for example, a customer maybe is starting out on a fractional size instrument, say like a violin, And then as they grow and progress over time, they might go from, let's say, an eighth size violin to a sixth size violin to a quarter size to a half size, all the way up to a three-quarter, and then finally a full-size violin. They're not necessarily renting to purchase, the fractional size violin, but they are potentially earning credit towards the purchase of a full-size instrument, which is what a rent-to-rent contract allows you to do. Now, if you're not in the music industry, say for example, if you are in another industry, say for example like the firearms industry, you might actually use this type of contract for a membership purchase, where the customer is going to say, I want to purchase membership to your range, or I want to purchase membership to your whatever services you provide in part with that membership. And by putting that type of purchase onto a rent-to-rent contract, the membership stays active so far as they keep this contract active. They essentially can return it at any time, and the contract itself can be set up with a credit card attached to it or a checking account, so that automatic billing can occur, say every month or every quarter, or however often you set it up. So that's kind of the idea of a rent-to-rent contract. A rent-to-own, by the converse, allows the customer to rent an item, and then over the course of however long, maybe 12, 24, 36 months, whatever, they're going to ultimately purchase that item. They don't acquire ownership of that item until the rent-to-own contract is paid in full, and that is the key difference between a rent-to-own and a sales contract. A sales contract essentially does the same thing, but the instrument or the inventory item or whatever it is considered sold immediately upon the beginning of that contract. Now, from I guess you could say more of a logistics or a legal standpoint, there are two kind of key differences between this when it comes to the sales tax being due. So if you need to report your sales tax immediately, you're going to want to set this up as a sales contract. If you report the sales tax due either over time or at the end of the contract, you would do a rent-to-own. So those are some kind of key differences there. So you'll want to confer with whoever your business strategist is to find out which of these two types is most appropriate for you. Now, along those lines, the next two here, where it says simple interest rent and simple interest sales, are essentially very similar to the rent-to-own or a sales contract. There's just differences in the way that the interest on the contract is handled. If you don't charge interest on your contracts, not a big deal. You would probably most likely just use one of these two, the rent-to-own or the sales contract. But if you do have interest on either of these, what AIM is going to do is it's going to calculate what the amount is for each monthly payment or periodic payment, and it's just going to essentially keep that consistent over the duration of the contract. It doesn't matter when the payment comes in, if it comes in on the date that it's due, or if it comes in early, or if it comes in late. It's basically tabulating the same amount each month towards principal, tax, and interest. Now, to kind of go along with that, if you want AIM to calculate a difference in how much interest is actually being applied or taken when you take the payment based on the due date, then you may want to consider the simple interest contract. A simple interest contract takes into consideration when that payment's coming due. It's essentially more along the lines of what you might see at a financial institution, where when the payment comes in, it applies everything it can to interest, and then it pays down the remaining amount, the principal and tax, or what you could consider the amount of finance. Then each day, interest starts accruing based on the APR of the contract. So if you want the system to keep track of it that way, then you may want to consider the simple interest contracts. Apart from that, it handles it very much like the rent-to-own and the sales contract, where the simple interest rent considers the item sold at the end of the contract, and with a simple interest sales, the item is sold immediately and the sales tax is due right away. The last contract default is an extended warranty, and this is typically used when something is already owned by the customer and they want to pay for extended maintenance or service on that item after the fact. So the extended warranty contract default does not require that it be attached to an inventory item. That is optional. You could sell a blanket extended warranty contract to someone, and then any item that they bring in, if there is no SKU or serial attached to the contract, will basically show that when you are using the service module and that item comes in, or any item comes in underneath that customer's account. But if it is attached to a specific SKU or serial, then when that item goes onto a service contract, it will display that there is an extended warranty contract active on the customer's account. So those are the 6 types of contract defaults. Let me know if that makes sense or if there's any questions on that. Again, feel free to use the chat box over on the right-hand side of the screen if you have any questions. Now, apart from the contract type, what you will also be setting up for each default is some additional settings on whether or not you're going to be charging tax on certain levels of the payment. And these may change depending on the contract type. For example, you notice that these all remain here for rent to rent or rent to own, a sales contract, etc. But at the extended warranty option, the maintenance and the other option, which is lease services, those options go away because an extended warranty contract essentially is a maintenance contract. Let me define what that means. So principal is just the overall value of the item going onto the contract. Do you need to charge sales tax on that? Yes or no? If yes, you choose your appropriate tax rate. Maintenance is an additional charge on top of your principal and tax amount due. And if you have maintenance attached to a contract, this is basically an extra amount that the customer is paying. It's not going towards the payoff of the item. Instead, if something should happen to the item while it's on contract, the customer can bring it back. And if it's something that is covered by the monthly maintenance that they're paying, then the services may not necessarily need to be charged to the customer. Everyone has their own particular maintenance plan, so you just kind of want to keep that in mind as you are factoring this in. Now, late fees, if you need to charge late tax on any late fees, you can make that same selection here. And then in the case of lease services, these are additional amounts that you are collecting on top of the other options. And again, it's just whether or not you are collecting sales tax on that. So you'll notice with the rent-to-rent option, an additional drop-down is here for a payoff formula. The payoff formula is set up elsewhere in the Add Change Payoff Formulas area, and it simply denotes how much credit you are allowing the customer to accrue for those monthly or periodic rental payments. Let's say, for example, if the customer is renting that violin, like I said, for $20 a month, of that $20, are you allowing the customer to accrue any credit of that payment for the purposes of a purchase? And if so, how much credit are you accruing and how long are you allowing them to accrue it for as far as how many payments would apply? There are up to 2 levels of credit that you can apply. So for example, you might say that they can accrue 100% credit, and that is principal and tax, for let's say the first year, and then maybe you're only allowing them to collect 75% of their total principal and tax payment for the next 2 years. And then beyond that, they're not going to accrue any more credit until they either return and start a new contract, or they just turn around and they use that credit towards the purchase of something. Then, if you'd like, you can cap that credit at a certain percentage of the value of the item on contract. And then also you can select whether or not you want to give any credit for late payments. And if you are setting up some type of contract where they're basically renting indefinitely, but they have the option to keep renting until they actually do pay off that type of contract, you could also check mark to pay off the contract if their accrued credit exceeds the purchase price of the item on contract. So typically you would not have a cap on there in those cases, and you might actually say that the second level is indefinite, in other words 99 payments. So you might set up something like that. You can have multiple payoff formulas that you've created, and then you simply select which payment formula would apply for the type of rental contract, and specifically the rent-to-rent contract that you are establishing. Now you'll notice that the payoff formula goes away and it's replaced by an interest rate when I choose either rent-to-own or sales contract or simple interest, rent or sales. So the interest rate, this is where you can establish how much interest is going to be charged to the customer. This is an APR, an annual percentage rate. So say, for example, if this is 14%, that 14% would be divided into 12 months, and that's how it's going to calculate what the monthly interest would be. You'll notice that there is an additional option that shows up when I choose either of the simple interest contracts, and that's for a number of free months. So if you say that the customer can put something onto a rent-to-own or a sales contract that does have interest, but the first 6 months are interest-free, you can plug in the number 6 there, and then that way it won't start actually accruing interest until 6 months after the initial contract date. So those are the settings here on this first default tab. And again, you can just name the contract default whatever you want it to be called. If you have multiple contract types, putting in a name here that is similar or the same names as what you call your rental plans would be very beneficial for your staff when they are going to put something onto a contract. And again, we'll take a look more on that in detail when we get to next week's session, next Thursday, when we start to actually key in contracts and take payments. Now, here on the Details tab, these details may adjust slightly from one type of contract to another. Let's go ahead and switch this back to a rent-to-rent. And you can see not much changes here. Let's just talk about what we're looking at here. First and foremost, should a contract that is using this default be set up for auto pay? These can be adjusted on a contract-by-contract basis. You don't have to have two different defaults, one that is auto pay and one that is not, if that's the only difference. But if you would prefer that your customers give you a credit card or a checking account number in lieu of expecting them to send in or stop by with a payment every month, then it would be best to select auto pay, and then you can choose what is the preferred type of auto pay method, either credit card authorization or bank debit. And again, you can turn that off on any given contract or adjust the type. Now you could also say only do auto pay if the payment is late by a certain number of days. So if the customer is expected to mail in or send in a payment, but you want to ding their card as a backup if they're late by 2 days, for example, you could check mark both of those options and then fill in the number of days grace that you're essentially giving them. To the right of that, you can select how frequently the payments are expected to be due. This defaults to monthly frequency with a payment frequency of 1, which means a payment is due every month. If the payments are only expected to be due every quarter, you may change this to 3. So it's basically due every 3 months. There are 12 months in a year, so that's what I mean by due every quarter, 3, 6, 9, 12. If it's due every 4 months, whatever it might be, and that can change. Excuse me. If you switch this to a daily frequency, then this is just how many days go in between every payment. Now, if you are using a long-term contract for essentially a weekly rental, you certainly can do this. You would just make the frequency be daily with a pay frequency of 7. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you are wanting to set up, say, for example, like a weekly piano rental or a weekly heavy equipment rental or whatever it might be. Let's go ahead and just switch that back to monthly and 1. Now, as far as the late charge frequency, this is just how many times the late charge is going to be charged in months or days. So you can set that up separate from the normal payment frequency. If you are going to charge any kind of late amount, this is where you can specify what the amount is and whether that is a dollar amount or a percentage of the payment. And if you are giving them a certain amount of grace before that gets assessed, you can put in a grace period here. So let's say, for example, if a payment is due on the 15th, but you're not going to charge that amount until 5 days later, the 20th. You can put that in there. So basically, it'll just be 5 days after the payment is due. So you can set that up that way. Now, back over here to the left, you can see there's options here for lease pool. We're not going to get into a whole lot regarding lease pool during these sessions. If you'd like, I do have a pre-recorded webinar all about lease pool inventory that you can check out in the contract menu here on the video portal. Suffice to say that if you have this check marked and an item is not already in your lease pool, this will add it to the lease pool with whatever schedules you give it for tax and book depreciation. So again, if you want more details on that, check out that webinar and you'll get all the details that you need there. The price level. So this will determine what price the item is going to use that's going onto the contract. And this can be very helpful. If your normal selling price is our price, but you want to charge an overall different amount if the item is going onto, let's say, a sales contract or a rent to own. Maybe you don't necessarily want to charge interest, but you do want to collect a larger value for the sale. You may switch this, for example, to retail price or price A, B, or C. Basically just an alternative price from your normal hour price, selling price at point of sale. You can also establish whether or not the payment schedule is irregular here. So normally the payment is due every day or the same day based on the payment frequency. So if this is a monthly frequency and we start a contract on the 22nd of the month, it'll always be due the 22nd of each month going forward. You can adjust that if you need to, but suffice to say, if you check mark this irregular payment schedule option, each time you take a payment, AIM will ask you what is going to be the next due date for the given contract. So this can be especially helpful if you have an irregular payment type schedule. Say, for example, if you rent for the year for, let's say, like a school rental, but their first payment covers, let's say, 9 months, and then they're taking a summer payment for 3 months, and then they're going back to another 9 months. So by having that check marked, it'll basically ask you what is going to be the next due date, and you can also adjust the amount due at that time as well. Hopefully these last two options here are fairly straightforward. Ask for student and school. If you have that check marked, this will be most applicable to music type rental contracts, where you can then put in who is the student that the instrument is for and what school are they attending. And if we are talking about payoff type contracts, you can check mark to show payoff on the receipt. So basically, each time they get a payment of their receipt, not only will it show how much they paid against the rental, but it'll also show how much the payoff is at that time. And speaking of payoff, if you do offer a discounted payoff based on early payment, say for example, if the customer, if they pay off within the first 3 months, for example, they get 15% off of the balance that's remaining at that time. You can set that up here. And you can set up multiple levels. So maybe they get 15% off of the total balance if they pay off within 3 months. But maybe they miss that window, but you want to give them a remaining window for a different window for the remainder of that first year. So we could then say the number of months is 12, and maybe we make this be 5%. So if they pay off within the first 3, they get 15. If they miss that, but then they make a payment or a payoff between months 4 through 12, they get 5% off of the remaining balance at that time. And you can set up as many levels as you need. Now, if they do go late and you would like AIM to be able to send out delinquency notices, the fourth tab is where you can establish the frame of when those notices would be due to be sent out. This is going to be number of days beyond the due date of any given contract. So you'll want to kind of keep this in consideration with your grace period. Say, for example, this is 5 days before a late charge gets assessed. Maybe you want to go ahead and make the first notice be due on that 5th day. So essentially, they've missed the window where they can still make a payment and not have a late fee assessed. The notice 1 then might say, your contract is past due, you've been assessed a late fee of X amount, please remit payment ASAP. And then you have up to 4 notices that you can send, each kind of increasing in the urgency of the customer essentially saying, hey, get us the money that you owe us. Maybe you make the notice 2 be 15 days past the original due date. Maybe this is 25, and maybe this is 40. With the notice 4 kind of being the most urgent one, where you're essentially saying that you are now going to send their contract to a collections agency to either A, get the money that is owed to you, or B, get your item back that's on the contract, or both, ideally, assuming that the customer no longer wants to kind of stay on the contract. But you basically can set up to 4 notices. We don't worry about the last tab, the Active E tab here. We'll get into that more when we talk about Active E specific type settings for future live streams and sessions. But that is the basic gist of your contract defaults. Now, again, some of these details may change. For example, if we switch this to an extended warranty type contract, you'll notice that this now has some different options here. You'll notice that the lease fee options are gone because those wouldn't apply to an extended warranty contract, nor would that option apply to a sales type contract, or either sales or simple interest sales. You can specify what a straight up down payment amount is and what a default payment and down payment, so monthly payment and down payment are. You can also start straight to tab 2, and that will make more sense next Thursday when we take a look at keying in a contract. Tab 1 of a new contract window is asking what's the inventory going onto the contract, and tab 2 is where the details of said contract are going to be keyed in. How much is the amount? Is there a down payment? When's the next due date? Are there terms of the contract? So if you don't need to put an item onto a contract of extended warranty, this is just a blanket warranty contract that the customer is setting up, you may want to start on tab 2 so that you don't have to skip past the inventory item when you're keying one in. So those are just kind of the basics there. I don't think there's too much else that changes from one contract type to another over here. You can see we're still no longer showing the lease pool option for sales contracts. If we switch to the simple interest options, you can have an additional option here for check marking that a payment is required each month. So with a normal contract, when I say normal, I mean rent to own or sales contract, if the customer pays ahead, in other words, let's say the amount that they owe each month is $20. If they pay $40, that just simply pushes their next payment out 2 months instead of 1. But if you prefer that they always need to make a payment every month, they can't essentially pay ahead, then you'll want to choose the option for simple interest so that you can then check mark the option of a payment being required every month. So in my previous example of a $20 a month payment and they pay $40, that extra $20 is going straight towards the principal and tax, and it's not pushing them out another month. It's simply saying you've paid extra on top of the principal that you've already paid, but we're still requiring that you make another payment next month. So it's, again, kind of more along the lines of a financial type contract. Say, for example, if you took out a loan at the bank or something along those lines. So that is the basic gist of your contract defaults. If you're getting started with this module, go ahead and start to play around with some of these options and think about what are the best types of defaults that would apply to your contract module. If you've got any questions, definitely go ahead and punch those into the chat bar over there on the right. Either way, I don't know which exactly way I'm pointing here. Probably this way. My right, or my left, your right. Yeah, if there's no questions, we will see you next Thursday when we will be taking a look at keying in a contract as well as taking payments on those. And if you want to skip ahead to these other details, like for delinquencies or other functions that we'll be looking at later on in the month. This is technically something that I covered in a previous webinar, an hour-long webinar. I actually did a two-parter on the long-term contract modules. They're each an hour long. The first one went into kind of this whole process of setting up defaults and taking payments and new contracts. And the second one kind of delved into other functions such as late notices and returns and things like that. So I will leave those prior webinars up until the end of the month. Normally when I do these new webinars, these live streams, I take down the old live streams, the old recorded webinars that they're essentially replacing, because these are more concise and much shorter webinars and live streams to digest. But I'll leave those other ones up until the end of the month, at which point, when all 4 of these are then recorded, we'll go ahead and take those other ones down, just so that there's no confusion about one recording versus another. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all next Thursday when we will be taking a look at keying in contracts and taking payments. Until then, I hope you make it a great day, and we will see you down the road.